Mehul, hey, thanks for coming on, man.
Well, hey, Jared, good to see you. It's always a pleasure to speak with you, and congratulations on this new video cast.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. Well, it's been what, a couple years since we've seen each other?
Yeah, I think I last saw you at Loyola Law School when you were giving a presentation.
Yeah, I came down to LA, showed you a little bit about the MVAC, and so how's law school going?
Well, I'm no longer in law school, actually. I gave it a shot, but
Okay.
juggling that, going part time in the evening with my practice, I decided I couldn't do both things well. So it's still a dream of mine. And
Uh-huh.
the time I was there was a great benefit. I learned some legal writing and how to think like a lawyer. But what I have been doing is I'm still working with the Loyola Project for the Innocent,
Hmm.
working on post conviction DNA and wrongful conviction cases. So that's one way I've been kind of keeping my legal mind sharp and still working in those arenas.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I'll tell you what, the Innocence Project folks are doing some good stuff. I'm actually going to be talking with Greg Hampikian from the
Right.
Idaho Innocence Project next week. Yeah. So that should be really interesting. But you said something. Thinking like a lawyer. I'm not sure you
Right.
want to go that far, but definitely keep your DNA analyst hat on.
Well, and the motto of my company, though, is bridging science and law, because ultimately the two sides have to be able to speak, right? All of the science is great, but we're not doing it for research magazines and to pat each
Hmm.
other in the back and to cover cool things. The bottom line is what can be argued in a court of law based on the evidence.
Right.
So, that's really my passion now, working as a DNA consultant, kind of working in both worlds and trying to bring them together, trying to educate everybody. So it's not just my clients who are inmates or defense attorneys, but uh, I might educate the prosecutor as well. They
Right.
might not know the shortcomings in their evidence.
Right.
Certainly need to educate the judge.
Hmm. Yeah. I actually had a kind of a conversation. I think it was on LinkedIn with a guy out of I want to say he was out of the UK, and he was talking about actually trying to merge lawyers and DNA analysts and that whole between the science and the law. And I was just like, dude, there is no way that people that are really good at law are going to be also really good at the science. You just can't do it. I mean, there's
No,
there's
that's true.
too
I mean,
much.
the old joke is, hey, you went to law school because you didn't want to study biology and physical chemistry and all of that kind of stuff. So, I mean, to your point, I thought maybe the ultimate way I could contribute is an attorney with a DNA background, and that still may happen. But
Mhm.
I got to tell you, there are times I'm sitting with either inmates or defendants. I'm sorry, inmates or defense attorneys who have a very serious case. Maybe it's a death penalty, and they kind of don't know the first thing about DNA. And I'm like, well, maybe that's the most important role for me is to stay as that DNA consultant and
Mhm.
help these attorneys along.
Yeah. Well, and on the same sense, I think the scientific community can't also be experts in the law. I mean, things just
No.
change too fast, especially the science nowadays. DNA. Well, in fact, why don't you talk a little bit? I mean, since you've been involved in, um, all the way back to where you first started um, till now, how much has DNA changed?
Well, it's unbelievable how much it's changed, and of course, the courts never keep up with the science.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of things, new techniques on the horizon that are cool, but they're just not ready yet for prime time. But if you look at the rate of change of DNA over the last 5 years compared to the 15 years before that, it's just astronomical. On all ends. So it could be that the testing's quicker, so there's more cases in the
Hmm.
justice system.
Hmm.
Um, Used to be DNA was reserved for the most serious cases because DNA took a long time to analyze. It was more expensive, more labor intensive, all of that. Now, of course, property crimes or all sorts of things, even like a DUI case where there's a question of the authenticity of that blood vial. Now
Hmm.
DNA is used pretty regularly. So given all of that, I think the analysts can barely keep up, much less
Right.
the judges and the attorneys. So
Right.
there's definitely a need for bridging those sides.
Right. So what is this the saying? Jack of all trades, expert in none, or something like that.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I just think if people try to do it all, then they'll just end up sucking at everything. And
Yeah.
that'd really be
Well,
a shame.
yeah,
So,
or thinking you know it, like maybe an attorney had a DNA case 4 or 5 years ago, and maybe he or she was the office's expert, but okay, well, this case has probabilistic genotyping. This case has the M-Vac. It's a whole different situation. And
right.
not to mention that whose DNA it is obviously typically the most important question, but because we're looking at things that are trace DNA, we don't know the body fluid, we don't know
Hmm.
how long it's been there, when it got there.
Right.
Now, a lot of times the bigger question is, well, what's the significance of that?
Hmm.
How did it get there? Was it from direct touch? Was it transfer? Is it old DNA? Is it background DNA? So context now is really a huge issue.
Right. Right. Yeah. As the sensitivity of DNA in general increases, you tack on, like, the MVAC is going to collect more.
Right.
It's going to collect more of everything that's there, including people that don't have anything to do with the case.
Yeah. Yeah.
You start with that, and then you move into the lab processes, it being so much more sensitive than it used to be. And then even with the software at the end, it's still difficult. But like you said, the ability to determine how old the DNA is, how degraded it is. I mean, that's stuff like that is just absolutely fantasy. It's just amazing. And to me, that's the whole purpose of what I said earlier, is that, trying to keep up with all of that stuff and trying to keep up with law, you just can't do it.
Exactly. And then, of course, DNA is scientific, but some of these things in terms of transfer, they're not an exact science. They
Right.
depend on a lot of factors. So when you're asked to give an opinion in court about maybe transfer or something like this, I mean, it goes back, it's like direct exam, cross exam, redirect, recross, the judge asks questions. And it's like,
Right.
well, depending on this, depending on that, what are some of the
Yeah.
contingencies? So you really have to know your stuff, which means the lawyers have to know their stuff, the judges have to know their stuff,
Right.
because
Right.
DNA can be oversold very easily. It still has
Hmm.
very strong branding. Just the fact that a defendant's DNA is found on a piece of evidence or at a crime scene, automatically, an uneducated jury, or somebody not familiar with forensic science, they're going to put a lot of significance on that. So
Hmm.
it's up to the advocates on either side to really explain what that means, and let them know that, what, it's not that hard for someone to leave DNA behind. It's not that hard for it to be contaminated, and all of these other things that you have to think about.
Right. Right. So let's go back a little bit. How
Yeah.
did you get started in DNA?
I studied biochemistry back in Chicago at the University of Illinois.
Hmm.
And I originally thought I was going to go to med school. And I
Okay.
found out that sort of course wasn't for me, taking that much time. So I was really interested in molecular biology and DNA in my studies. And I didn't know how I wanted to apply that. I didn't see myself just sitting in a research lab, just seemed kind of boring to me.
Hmm.
And about my junior or senior year,
I
uh,
I don't see you and your personality sitting in a lab very long, man.
well, yeah, a lot of people ask me, hey, do you miss being in the lab? And it's like, well, now that I'm free, no. But so I was at a career fair at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and the Illinois State Police was there. And
Uh-huh.
they were talking about, hey, DNA analysis in a crime lab. It was pretty early. This was, probably early 90s.
Hmm.
And so I didn't even know that was done, really. And I
Hmm.
assumed that, hey, if you're working in a police crime lab, you must be a sworn deputy, which I found not the case. So I became interested because here was a practical application of the studies that I enjoyed,
Hmm.
but you were doing something cool. You
Hmm.
weren't necessarily stuck in a laboratory because you could go to court and you could go to crime scenes.
Right.
So that's what initially got me hooked. And then about a year or two later was the O.J. Simpson case. And I was just fascinated with some of the things you and I discussed about the fact that you kind of have to know the law and science, and I looked at like
Right.
Barry Scheck, and I'm like, I didn't understand. Like, is this guy a DNA analyst, or how does he know this, being an attorney? So all of that interplay in court really, really fascinated me. So ultimately, when I graduated in 1995, my first forensic gig was in San Bernardino County, California. So I,
Hmm.
made the migration out to California, and I've been here ever since.
Nice. Well, it's interesting. I interviewed Cheryl McCullum out of Atlanta
Yeah.
a couple weeks ago, and she said something that I thought was just really interesting, where she said, back in the 80s and 90s, it was all about finding evidence and and determining it based on legality, doing things what was legal.
Right.
Now you have to do things, of course, within what is legal, but also what is scientific, because the crime scene has gone from just trying to learn exactly what happened at the crime, but also based on evidence, based on the scientific evidence, how it happened. And
yeah, that's true. So it touches everybody. So attorneys who don't handle major cases, now they're getting DNA cases in their lap because it's for a property crime. Patrol officers, you can't send a CSI person from a crime lab to every crime scene, but now, maybe a patrol officer has to swab a steering wheel, or they have to pick up evidence. So they have to be trained on at least the basics, contamination prevention, et cetera. Well, that's always changing because, like you say, the testing is more and more sensitive. So all of a sudden it wasn't good enough to have gloves. You had to have a mask. And then, on and on, we have to be more and more careful. But there are certainly people who are minimally trained, who are in the chain of evidence with DNA sample collection, because it's just so prevalent.
Yeah. I don't think most people understand how much DNA you're actually breathing out with each breath, or every time you touch a substance, how much DNA you're actually depositing in there. And
well,
it may not show up on one of these tests, but then again, it might.
Well, the example I use, if there's a question about, well, how probable is transfer? How does it work? When I review the work of DNA crime labs, I get all the dirty laundry as well, contamination records and all of that. And I think most people would be surprised how often an analyst contaminates evidence with their own DNA. Now, that's despite them wearing a mask, wearing gloves, following all the protocols. Are there some bad analysts? Sure, but I don't think it's so much that. I think it's a testament to how easy it is to contaminate your DNA, because you don't need that much of it to show up in a test, particularly if you're using sensitive sampling like the M-Vac.
Yeah, and you compound that with some people aren't trained, but even if they are, mistakes happen. You might actually, if it's hot, especially some of the places down south, you can just be sweating profusely and just accidentally contaminate something. But
yeah, I mean, in the laboratory, you've got nice pristine conditions and you're probably climate controlled and all that, but you can't control the weather when you're swabbing evidence that, you can't bring everything back to the crime lab. And I have that too, because I go to police departments, evidence lockups, and swab things, and it's not always the optimal, circumstances. So I'm changing my gloves like a, crazy person 25 times and, just trying not to sweat on it. But of course, now, we're at the point where anybody who may have touched the evidence, be it a crime scene investigator, police officer, CSI, typically the crime lab has their DNA profile on file so they can cross-check and make sure it isn't accidental contamination.
Right. Yeah, it's crazy how many times I've had a buccal swab taken from me. I'm not sure how many crime labs around the world have my DNA profile, but I definitely can't turn to any kind of a career of crime, because I would get caught really fast.
Absolutely. Well, and now you have to worry about if your third cousin is doing like genealogy or something. So we all could be tied to a crime, within a few years very easily.
Right. Well, I guarantee my relatives would turn me in pretty fast.
Yeah, so, especially when you get to like a third cousin, they don't have any allegiance to you. You don't even know who they are. So
yeah, well, they might just do it for the reward. But
right.
One thing that I have to mention is the importance of the investigator. Once we start talking about the actual DNA, and if someone's DNA shows up at a crime scene and they had nothing to do with the crime, that's just one piece of it. It doesn't automatically mean that they are going to be a suspect or that they're going to be convicted of the crime. That just means that they have to be there's a reason that their DNA showed up.
Well, and this is the problem. A lot of times a crime lab, once they get an association with a known person, like a defendant, they may stop their analysis. Now, could that be bias? Maybe, but also, crime labs, they got to crank out widgets. They are severely backlogged. So unfortunately, they can't treat every case like it's the case of the century. So
Right.
it goes either way. I mean, it could be that, hey, you get the result that you think you wanted to get and you stop, or it could just be a timing or bandwidth issue, really.
Hmm. Yeah. I think law enforcement in general, and including crime labs, are some of the most underfunded areas of the entire government. It doesn't matter what level it's at, whether it's city, county, state, or federal. It's just crazy, the demands on them, and yet they don't have the funding, they don't have the personnel to do it right. But like you said, you can't just test everything.
No, no.
It has to go through a rigorous process to determine what would be probative and what wouldn't. But it's interesting that the entire process. In fact, let me just have you answer this question instead.
Yeah.
If you were to be talking to someone that's not involved in the whole DNA and investigative process, give me the steps that would typically go through, including, and the crime lab is going to be in the middle in there. So you got the crime, and then go from there all the way to, say, the actual conviction or exoneration, whatever is at the end.
Yeah. So, I mean, the personnel at the crime scene, they have to be able to recognize what could be DNA evidence. And that's not so easy anymore. It's not just a vaginal swab or a pile of blood or anything obvious like that. You now have to be creative. So the crime scene investigator really has to meet with the detective and try to figure out, to the best extent possible, where could there be probative evidence to sample. And that may be blind swabbing, that might be using visualization techniques such as fluorescein or something like that to find it.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have to package it correctly so that it's not spoiled, so that there's not contamination.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be mindful of the chain of custody. I'm looking at a lot of post-conviction cases that are 20, 30 years old, and some of the procedures that were followed were less than stellar, and there becomes real questions in the chain of custody. So, all right, so now we get the evidence to the laboratory, and the analyst will look at it. The first question is, well, can I identify a body fluid? Is there blood? Is there semen? Is there saliva? And if not, how and where am I going to sample this? And that's going to take some common sense. A great example is, let's say that there's a ligature that's found, like a piece of rope. If you were just to run a swab around the whole length of the rope, you're going to get a pretty bad mixture. Mm-hmm. So if you think about the mechanics of it, the person doing the strangling is probably touching the rope on the ends of it to get leverage. So that's where you'd expect to find predominantly the offender's DNA. In the middle would be where it would be in contact with the victim. Right. So, a classical way to break down the sampling is break it into 3 or 4 quadrants, because you're going to get different relative proportions of the mixture. Mm-hmm. Or maybe the tool that you use. I know a lot of crime labs don't have the M-Vac, so they're not necessarily getting all of the DNA that they could. As a matter of fact, I had a post-conviction case where it involved a rope, and they swabbed it, not even in the right place, I would say. And then we actually used an M-Vac and got a little bit more information. So, okay, so now...
that actually happens a lot more than what people would think.
Right. And just to give another anecdote here, another post-conviction case I had where we used the M-Vac, the evidence had been swabbed twice previously. Mm-hmm. And with the M-Vac, we actually still got DNA results. In that particular case, it wasn't probative, but I just thought that was pretty cool that even though we got severely leftover evidence that, by the way, was 35 years old, there was still a result.
Wow.
So, okay, awesome. Now the DNA report is written. It goes to the prosecutor. The prosecutor has to understand what exactly that means, because now, these reports might as well be in a foreign language, right? Well, assuming a mixture of 4, there's a 80% contributor, a 20% contributor, likelihood ratio in this scenario is this, all this stuff that it's not straightforward. This is not clinical testing. Right. Like, yeah, we found alcohol in the blood, or we didn't find alcohol. Mm-hmm. So there really needs to be, before the case is tried or even charged, there needs to be a discussion between the crime lab and the prosecutor so that they understand fully what this means. Now, that doesn't happen all the time, for sure. Right. There's not the time for that. So now,
if I could just interject right here, it's, what you're describing could take months. It's like from the time the crime actually happened and the investigation starts, they gather the evidence, they move it to the crime lab. Again, because of some of the backlog that exists,
Right,
but
right.
also just the length of time. If you do it right, an investigation can take a long time. And
Absolutely.
so, in today's environment, it's all a now type of environment. And, I'm sorry, investigations don't just work that way. This isn't Gattaca where you can take a little machine and
Right.
sweep it over the guy's keyboard and, and you instantly know who did it.
Well,
This,
that's a good point, because maybe in the laboratory, actually the extraction, quantitation, amplification, typing, maybe that's done in 2 days, but it's prioritizing the case. There's a backlog. They may not get to it for 3 months.
right.
Maybe the front end, the evidence exam, that takes a while, on and
Mm-hmm.
on. So to actually get a finished report, like you say, is going to take months and months. Sometimes it's a magic bullet. Maybe it's a rape case. Boom, the guy's, it wasn't his semen. That's the end of it.
Right. Right.
But nowadays we're getting a lot more complicated types of answers. So now you move into, perhaps the preliminary hearing.
Mm-hmm.
Now the defense gets involved and there has to be production of discovery.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of defense attorneys, they don't know what discovery is. They get the report like, hey, I got the discovery. It says it's my guy and it doesn't look good. And so they have to be educated. Hopefully they have an expert who can at least guide them as to what else needs to be obtained from the crime laboratory, so they can
Right.
fully vet that and decide, listen, because maybe the case will resolve based on the DNA.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully with the input of an expert, say, yeah, this is solid. I don't know what you can do about it. But if it isn't, then, you go to trial, and then
Mm-hmm.
Prosecution expert testifies, and hopefully there's a thorough cross-examination to bring out any weaknesses,
Mm-hmm.
so that the juror gets a full picture of the evidence and what it means. So now, God forbid there's a conviction and the person is truly innocent.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't get fixed overnight at all. There's a whole process of appeals that have to be exhausted.
Right.
And you wonder how many people, a lot of people are in the justice system for the first time when they're convicted of a serious crime. So
Mm-hmm.
they don't know how this all works. And you would tend to just trust that your attorneys know what they're doing, and you might
Mm-hmm.
take their advice. And I've seen a lot of scary instances where, attorneys are getting paid $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 for a murder case, and they're just maybe stipulating to the DNA and not really investigating. And
Mm.
so it could be that a wrongfully convicted person could even just give up hope. Hopefully that's not the case.
Right.
And then hopefully they can dial into a good attorney or an innocence project. But even there, that's going to take months and months, if not years, to get to the point where you can get a DNA test that may actually set them free. So all of that to say is, it is so critically important to get this done right on the front end,
Right.
so that we can prevent this type of miscarriage of justice, which is a miscarriage of justice, and it's a lot of money and time wasted for all sides.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I appreciate you explaining that, because there's so many people that watch CSI and other crime shows
Right.
where they literally have to put the entire crime, the investigation, and the resolution in 43 minutes worth of airtime. And it just doesn't work that way.
Right. Investigation takes a long time.
Right.
Lab work, relatively short, but for the backlogs. But then the litigation takes forever. I mean, there's just pretrial hearing after pretrial hearing before you get anywhere to where you could possibly, have the case resolved or tried.
Yeah. Well, and it's, even for a flawed system, or for a system that is as good as ours is, there are still flaws in it. And I think the number one flaw with our system right now is just how long it takes. But if you start hacking off time, you have to shorten certain things, and then justice is not going to get served. Either the victim is going to get shortchanged because the person that actually committed the crime isn't going to be convicted, or if you shortchange the investigation or the lab processes or anything else, then perhaps somebody that didn't do it is going to get convicted on the other end just based on circumstantial evidence or something like that. And I think one of the biggest problems, again, with the now society is the lack of adult timeframes that many of us lose just because we have the world at our fingertips. We text somebody and we're like mad if they don't respond in 30 seconds. And yet, you equate that over to an investigation and something as serious as convicting somebody for a crime. And again, I'm going to be interviewing a guy next week that served 20 years for a murder he didn't commit.
Oh, wow.
And I can't wait. It's going to be a fascinating interview, but it's amazing that is the exception to the rule, but at the same time it happens. And how you completely eliminate that from happening and still maintain the integrity of the system, I really am not sure if that's possible. But
well, and what's scary, just going with the wrongful conviction, is obviously we've had DNA resolve a lot of those cases recently, almost 400, I think, by the Innocence Project.
Right.
But what percentage of cases where someone's wrongfully convicted actually have DNA evidence? I'm sure an extremely small percentage. So that's great that we can catch it with DNA, but most of the cases, there's not that kind of cross-check.
Well, you would hope that, since DNA just came on the scene, mid-90s, that from that point forward, there would be a less percentage of it, a less chance of a wrongful conviction. There's always going to be flaws, but.
Right. Yes and no. So, I mean, DNA actually was started in criminal investigation mid-'80s, but the technologies were clunky. So, initially when you're using RFLP in the mid-1980s, first of all, the testing would take 6 weeks. You would need a lot of DNA. You'd need a blood stain the size of a dime. So even, 80s, 90s, yeah, we had DNA, but it wasn't able to resolve as many cases as it is now, just because of the limitations of the technology. And so there's very often, I'm looking at a post-conviction case and testing that was done 5 years ago. I'm like, that was inconclusive. If we did that today, we could probably get an answer, just with the current evolution of the technology in a few years.
Yeah. And like I said, it's almost like a hockey stick, it's going up so fast that even something that was done, like you said, 5 years ago, if it wasn't done with the latest technology, then perhaps it needs to be run again. And
this is true. Yeah.
That's creating even more backlog. So.
Yeah, you're right. If we have to work all these cases twice, I mean, we're never going to get ahead.
Well, which is one resistance to the M-Vac, to be honest.
Yeah.
People are like, yeah, this is a great tool. And clearly there's a significant number of cases that deserve to actually be processed with the M-Vac. But, there's also other factors that come in line with it. And there's a little bit of resistance there, but whether
I understand it. The labs say, listen, we got enough cases as it is. We can't start. We're not looking for more cases. We should, but we can't. And then, of course, the data you get, with M-Vac, you might get very complicated mixtures and tough samples and all that. Well, some of that I think is put to bed now that we're in the era of probabilistic genotyping. So I think that excuse for getting more complicated data is going away. But I don't know. Sometimes I think of the cartoon, Jared, where, there's like the cavemen and they got the wheelbarrow with the square wheel. And then another caveman comes up with the circle, and taps on the shoulder. They said, no, we don't have time for that. So there may be some of that with technology like the M-Vac, because unfortunately it's very tough for a crime lab to validate a new system. I mean, they've got to pull people off of casework that they're already backlogged on. So even to get some of these advancements, be it the M-Vac or something else, to get them online in a crime lab, it's not an easy thing, and it takes much more time than it should. And like I say, they're not really caught up with the current science, because people have to work cases, and that's just the reality of it.
Well, and it's that's the nature of the beast. There's some labs that we've worked with that literally have a new person that they bring on that is specifically for validating new equipment, not just the M-Vac, but other pieces of equipment, and that's their job. They're not even in working cases anymore. It is their job to make sure that the lab is constantly updated on the latest and greatest. And unfortunately, not all labs can do that. But
no, that is a huge luxury. And I know it's got to be frustrating for the labs that there is a new technology every year, every 6 months or whatever. So you're constantly validating.
Yeah. Well, especially, I'm not sure if you've seen the latest FBI data where they compared the M-Vac with swabbing and taping.
Well, I can't miss it, Jared. I follow you on social media, so it's plastered all over the place.
Yeah, well, that's my job.
That's right. Yeah.
So, no, but in that, you were talking about, there were cases earlier where they'd been swabbed twice,
Yeah.
and you still got results with the M-Vac, and that's one of the things that the FBI showed, is that even after swabbing, the M-Vac pulled as much as 46 times more than what the swab originally did, which is just pretty amazing. So
That's very cool. And just to give another case example, a post-conviction case, evidence was 20 years old or so.
mhm,
And so we MVAC'd a bunch of clothing, and we didn't get that perpetrator's profile. We didn't get that one nice profile that we could put in CODIS or something like that. But
right,
the fact that the defendant's DNA didn't show up anywhere, there's the old adage, right? Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So defense says, hey, listen, we did this DNA testing. Defendant didn't show up. Great. Prosecutor says, absence of evidence, not evidence of absence. But, you think about it, because DNA testing is now so sensitive,
mhm,
right? Not finding DNA has a lot more meaning. Stack on top of that MVAC sampling, where you're getting every little crumb of DNA. Now, if you don't find someone's DNA, that has even more meaning. So that starts to chip
right.
away at that axiom that, it's there, but you couldn't detect it, or something like that.
And interestingly enough, the guy that I'm interviewing next week, that's exactly what happened in his case.
Mm-hmm.
And he supposedly was at the crime scene and supposedly did, handled certain things such as the victim's sweatpants and a teddy bear. And so they thought, well, let's MVAC these items and see if, and then we'll get his DNA, and then we'll
Case
be
closed.
100% justified for having him in prison.
Right.
Well, they MVAC'd him in certain places on each one of those items, and they came up with DNA, but not that guy's particular DNA. So then they were like, "Holy crap! We
Right.
need to to really." And you know who I'm talking about, the Chris Trapp case.
Chris Trapp, I imagine.
So then they, like you said earlier, you said they MVAC'd the hell out of it, didn't that? That was a hashtag for a while, wasn't it?
That's right. When the tables were turned and I interviewed you on my podcast, I think we
That's
came up
right.
with the MVAC the hell out of it.
Anyway, and then they came up with nothing. So then they actually got thinking about what the process was of getting this guy out of prison if there was absolutely no evidence to hold him. So
yeah, there's a lot of I'm looking forward to that episode. There's a lot of components to that case, with the genealogy and the DNA from the other person.
Right.
Wow. I mean, that case, there's so many issues wrapped into one on that one.
Right. Well, and it's absolutely amazing that they finally caught the guy that did it. What a crazy case that is, especially being in a small town, Idaho. You just don't have that kind of, those kind of cases are once in a lifetime, let alone, very often. So
yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah. But I'll tell you what, yeah, that case is going to be and that interview, I can't wait for it, because Chris Trapp is one amazing individual, and just being able to get him on is going to be really, really interesting.
Yeah, I remember seeing the video of you actually showing him the MVAC. I mean, what a cool moment that must have been for you.
Oh, that really was. I heard that this is shortly after he was released. I heard that he was going to be up in Boise. So, I threw the MVAC in the back of my car and drove up there, and was able to meet him and show him the system. Yeah, that was actually a very surreal moment. So.
Yeah, it's really good to be able to touch base with the people whose lives are actually
Mhm.
affected. And I think working in a crime lab, you could lose sight of that, because you're just looking at test tubes and numbers and all of that. So that's actually one of the things I really enjoy about what I'm doing now, is that,
Mhm.
I'm meeting with inmates and just kind of seeing it firsthand.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons that detectives and CSIs do what they do, is because they enjoy not only the problem solving aspect of it, but also being able to interact with the people, the community. There's always two sides to it. Both sides obviously have to be equally and justifiably represented. And, that's why one of the reasons I wanted to have you on is because I know, in the areas that you work in, number one, you're the epitome of a professional.
Well, thank you.
That you would have a real unique perspective that I think everybody is very interested in.
Yeah, and I mean, just real quick to give my background, I worked in law enforcement crime laboratories first.
Hmm.
I've been in forensic science for about 24 years now. 21 of that, specializing in DNA. But my first gig in forensic DNA, I worked in here in Southern California, San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department Crime Lab. So I was a criminalist there for about 6 years.
Hmm.
At the end of my term there, I was actually the DNA technical leader, person in charge of the technical operations.
Right.
Then a buddy of mine had this crazy idea that we should actually start our own private forensic DNA lab because
Uh-huh.
obviously the current labs couldn't keep up. There was always a backlog, and it
Right.
was a great business opportunity. So then
That's
there too,
easier
I
said than
was
done, isn't
easier said than done, absolutely.
it?
But so then at that point, again, I was a technical leader, lab director, all of that. But not only did we work with the prosecution, but we started working with the defense, as a private lab. And that's when I first started working directly with inmates. There
Hmm.
are a number of people, believe it or not, inmates who actually serve as their own attorney, and they defend themselves.
Oh,
So
interesting.
yeah, so that was kind of my that's why I say I've seen all sides of this. And so
Hmm.
now for the last 10 years or so, I'm doing purely defense consulting and post conviction. So I've had a pretty good 360 view of how everything works.
So that must be interesting, if an inmate is working as their own attorney. You were talking about how difficult it is to educate some attorneys on DNA.
Right.
What's it like educating an inmate?
It's actually very rewarding. It's kind of funny if you go and sit in front of someone who's got like tattoos all over their face and they look
Uh-huh.
really tough. And that moment you get through to them and they understand the evidence and they understand the meaning and maybe that there's some hope. I mean, that's very rewarding. But ultimately, I mean, as a forensic scientist, that's we have to be able to educate the general public because ultimately the juror is the consumption of this. So it is the person on the street who's not involved in science or law enforcement that really we have to convey this information to. And that's just the interesting challenge of our justice system.
Right. Oh, it's fascinating. Well, listen, I've kept you a little longer than what I originally intended, and I certainly appreciate you coming on. And I'll tell you, you're a wealth of information, and I will absolutely ask you to come on again if that's all right.
Yeah, let's do it, Jared. I very much enjoyed our discussion.
Okay. Well, you have a great day, and we will talk at you later.
You do the same. Take care, Jared.
Okay.